Good afternoon, peoples. Hope that you're having a grand day, that everything is going well, that we touch on some important conversation topics that have been talked about recently in a couple of different lives that need to have some attention brought to them. Hey, no, 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 no. I just started out. Nobody's late or early. We're just getting started. We got this. We got this. Oh, fuck. Maybe. Let's see if I've got this. I'm trying to share, and apparently sharing is not as much of my actual thing as I would think it is, which I would think it's actually pretty decent, but I'm having some problems here. Um, so we are just getting started, so don't worry about any of that. I haven't even said a word other than hello, so we are good. Um, Let me see if I can. I want to try and make sure and share this as much as possible. I also ask that everybody like smash the like button as much as possible. It just gets us out there a little bit more, makes it a little bit more seen. And I want to make sure that that happens as much as possible. I just shared it to I know who you are, but I can't remember the account name. So let me look and see if I can. Uh, I get so like it's not that I don't remember who you are like as my friend. It's that like I can't think through like um uh spellings of names. Actually, probably this one that just says user, because usually when it's just says user, it's because it's been banned. Probably this one as well. There's a couple people in here who are just users. So it's I love you all. You should not be getting banned this much. I mean, I totally get it because TikTok bans me all the fucking time too, because you know how that shit goes. Um, well, this is lying. It says Sleepy didn't watch my live within the last 30 days, and I know that Sleepy has watched my live in the last 30 days. So it's lying to me. It's lying to me. There we go. Many handles. Yeah, Sleepy was in God, I think Sleepy was in for at least a couple minutes, like, the last time I was in live, so, like, I don't know how it was like, "Sleepy hasn't been in your lives for more than 30 days," and I'm like, "Bitch, she was here last time. You're lying to me, you're lying to me." Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everybody. I hope everybody is having a grand time. If you're new to my lives, TikTok gives everybody who has 1,000 followers a live space, and I choose to use mine for education. I am an anthropologist and a historian and a storyteller, and I do archaeology. And I was a healer before I was an archaeologist, and in medicine before I was an archaeologist. So I have a lot of different informations, and I have spent like 40 years from the time I started reading, studying archaeology, anthropology, and history. And so I have been able to come up with a lot of different things and a lot of different knowledge. I have a website that I bibliography everything on, and widdaord.com. And I most of my newer stuff is on there. Most of my older stuff isn't because I can't give you shit from 30 years ago because I was like 15. I was on the streets. It's not like I was holding on to shit. Um, so I come in and try and give the information that I can so that everybody can get information. I want everybody to use their brains. We all have these beautiful, amazing brains that give us so much information. And when we can utilize that information and actually go through that information, and we are curious about things, which is a very natural state for humanity biologically, then we're able to parse things out. We're able to get new information. We're able to understand more. And one of the things that I'm really trying to get people to see and understand is the correlation between the oppression that we're all going through and the different things that we're doing to maintain that impression. Thank you so much, Atira. the different things that we ourselves are doing to kind of maintain the oppression that we're all going through. And so I really want to come in here today and talk about a couple of these things. We were doing a live the other day that was more of a educational thing, that it was a panel that I was invited in on. And all of these were topics of the conversation. And I wanted to make sure that we're bringing them in because some of them didn't get touched on while I was there. And so I want to make sure that we're talking about them. And so I figured today we talk about them. The first things that I want to go over, especially, hello, thank you. If you are new to my lives, is again, this is a space that TikTok gives anybody who has 1,000 followers. If you don't want to be here, you can scroll on, find somebody else's lives, go get your own 1,000 followers. But this is my space that TikTok gave me. Not white, indigenous. Thank you very much. This is the space that TikTok gave me, and I choose to use that for education. Part of that is because I don't believe that education should be behind a $40,000 a year paywall. So I'm going to share what I have. And the other part of that is the fact that most of that education that's behind that $40,000 a year paywall really gives us like words that are hard to understand and content that's really hard to get. So a lot of the times it's really difficult for us to understand, even if we have that $40,000 a year that we paid out for, right? And so I want to make sure, not Elizabeth Warren, but you can take it somewhere else. Are you Indigenous? Because if you're not, you don't have a say in this. So when we're looking at those things, it's important that we all have this vast knowledge that's out there, right? That we're all really getting this knowledge so that we can have this better understanding. And that's what I'm here doing. Thank you. The other thing is, in my space, I don't deal with racism. Race has been debunked. The theory of race does not exist. Racism still exists. Racism is structural within the United States. Racism is a huge fucking problem within our entire globe at this point, very much so within the structural systems that were built and founded on racism, though, which is one of the things that comes here within the US. And the other thing is, I don't deal well with phobias based on gender and desire. Oh, and culture and ethnicity still exist. Absolutely. Race does not exist. I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire. The idea that there's only two genders or only two biological sexes is very new. It's not very much something we have seen throughout history. It's something that's actually been very problematic when it started coming about within the last 150 years. And it's pretty deadly to us. And the idea that we're only supposed to be attracted to somebody of the opposite biological sex is an extremely new thought process as well. Throughout history, that thought process has not been present. It's very new and it's very much about controlling you. And so a lot of what I teach and a lot of what we go in, oh, yay, ooh, awesome. If you don't follow Nemo, you should follow Nemo. Nemo takes old books, or not old books, but takes books written by or hearing the words of Indigenous people across the United States, Mexico, Canada, and the countries within Abiyala, which is South America, and reads books from words from Indigenous people so people can actually get that thought process out there. That's actually going to be in our decolonization thought process a lot, Atira. So when we're looking at phobias based on gender and desire, what we're looking at is something that has been created to keep you in check, really. It is to keep you in check. And so that's a lot of the stuff that we talk about within my lives, is the different things that we got that keep you in check. The different things that we're dealing with that are causing the issues within us that are allowing us to be in this very traumatic space that we're in currently. I usually end my lives talking about the fact that we're all nurturing and we're all communal as a biological necessity, right? As nurturing communal people as a biological necessity. When you're dealing with a society that teaches you that community and nurture is wrong, you start to feel depressed and anxious. And so very many of us have this extreme disconnection and this extreme feeling of depression and anxiety. So that's why we have such high rates of unaliving, is because of this disconnection, is because of this feeling of pain within this. And when we're looking at these things, these all come down to this indoctrinated thought that we're all dealing with. This indoctrination of society that's trying to maintain control, trying to make you exploitable so somebody else can exploit you so that they can hoard wealth. Okay. And so it is that understanding through feeling like something is wrong that can actually help pull us out of the issues that we're dealing with currently, right? And so what we want to talk about today is what decolonization actually means, right? What the indoctrination that we're dealing with actually is, right? What the toxic gender thought process within our society actually is, and absolutely eat the rich, because the rich are not out to help you. The rich are out to kill you every fucking day of the week. They don't care about you. They have no compassion. They have no empathy, and they are toxic to humanity's continuance. So the first thing that I really want to talk about is, what does it mean to decolonize? Okay. Um, First thing that I want people to understand is that unless you are a member of a community that is still within the space that they have inhabited for many generations, that is a colonized space, and they are not the colonizer, they are the colonized. You cannot decolonize unless you are the colonized. So here in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, to decolonize, you have to actually be a member of, or have heritage or ancestry within one of the indigenous communities here within Turtle Island or within Abiyala to actually decolonize, because to decolonize is to remove the colonizing government within a space. There are several different ways that people move across the globe. One of the ways that people move across the globe is migration. This is moving into a space where nobody else is there and becoming a part of that space. Another way is immigration. This is moving into a space where there's already a community there and becoming a part of the community that is already there. And another way is colonization. And colonization is when you move into a space, usually through conquering that space, take control of the government in that space and replace it with your own. That is what colonization is. It's not somebody moving into the United States. You're not colonizing if you're just moving here, right? You might be actively participating in the colonization government, and therefore you would be a colonizer in that point. And yet, if you are just moving, this is immigration. It's just moving into a space and adapting to the space and the people within the space and the community and the governance within the space. So unless you are a member of a group that is, or a member of a community that is currently being colonized, is currently under colonization rule, you cannot actually decolonize. Now, you can decolonize your mind. You can decolonize your specific community, helping them to help others decolonize, right? You cannot decolonize a space if you are the colonizing element within that space, right? So if you are somebody who is of only European descent, or somebody who is of descent that is only outside of Turtle Island and Abiyala, to include Hawaii at this point, right? But outside of these spaces, and you live within these spaces, what you need to be working on is the decolonization of your thought process, the decolonization of your brain, the decolonization of the world that you, like your home, like your space, right? And then what you have to work on to decolonize is to go to one of the local communities that is colonized and offer your services. Now, when I say offer your services, I do not mean offer your ideas. I do not mean go in and tell people what needs to be done. What I mean is, I walk into a space and I go, I'm really good at talking and storytelling and healing. And I shit suck at math and computers. I can bead like a motherfucker. I can sew. And I go into a space and I say, I have these talents. I can frontline every day of the week. I have these talents. How can I help? What can I do to uplift and support you? I'm not giving ideas. I'm not telling you what you need to do. I am not a white savior, right? I'm not going in there to save anybody. I'm going in there to provide the skill sets that I have so that they can be utilized so other people can decolonize their space. So if you are on a decolonization journey and you do not belong to one of the indigenous spaces that is colonized, you can decolonize your brain. You can decolonize your life thought processes. You can decolonize all of those things. You cannot decolonize until you are actively helping the communities that are under colonization to remove the colonizers from their space. I'm going to repeat that. If you are not a member of a community that has been colonized, you can decolonize your brain. You can decolonize your way of life, but you are not decolonizing until you are actively helping a local community or a community that is under colonization rule to overthrow the colonization. And again, that should never be done with a white savior mentality. That should never be done with you going in and saying, oh, I know what to do. I have all of these ideas. And I think if we do this, this, and this, and this, what that is I have these skills. I have these talents. How can I be of use to you? How can I be of support to you? Right? So when we're looking at those things, we need to understand those differences. Very many people don't. Very many people will also tell you that if you are a European that you can't decolonize. That's not true. You can. You can decolonize your brain. You can decolonize your way of life, and you can help other people to remove the colonizers in their area, right? So you can decolonize and still be of European descent within the United States. You still have to help the indigenous communities in your area to overthrow the colonization rule, right? Again, not as a white savior, right? It would be treason if it was my government, but it's not my government, so it's not treason. So I'm not piling on white guilt. White guilt is a ridiculous thing, right? White guilt is a ridiculous idea. The idea that I should feel guilty for my ancestors instead of actively changing the systems of oppression that my ancestors built. Right? And the idea that anybody who is actively working to change the systems of oppression that their ancestors built must be suffering from white guilt, right? Now, I understand that kind of fear that goes around being so obviously mixed, right? I have ancestors on every side. Every side. I have ancestors that were colonizers and ancestors that were indigenous and ancestors that were stolen from Africa and ancestors who were colonized in Europe and then came over here to escape colonization in Europe. I have ancestors on all sides of the boards. I have ancestors that raped and ancestors that were raped. I have ancestors on every side of the board. That doesn't mean that I should feel white guilt. It doesn't mean that you should feel white guilt. What it means is that I should be actively working to change the systems of oppression that my ancestors that were colonizers in placed. Right? It means that I should actively be working to uplift my ancestors who were colonized and return their governance and their autonomy to the spaces that they are in. Right? It doesn't mean that I should sit there and white savior this shit. It doesn't mean that I should sit there and stew in it, right? What are you proud to be proud of? Are you proud to be plastic? Are you proud to be exploitative? Are you proud to kill people? Are you proud to not have compassion or empathy? Is that what you're proud of? White is not a skin color. White is a culture and a state of mind. That's what white is. White is a culture and a state of mind. It is not a skin color because we are all shades of brown, right? We all have melanation within us, right? And because we are all shades of brown and we all have melanation within us, white is not a skin color, right? White is a state of mind, right? White is a thought process. White is plastic. White is buying a new phone every year. White is having the biggest and the best. White is exploitation, right? And it was to classify people into a categorization that we no longer use because it has been proven to be a false categorization. Phenotype does not indicate genotype, and we should understand that more. Most of us don't understand that, but phenotype does not indicate genotype. What color my skin is doesn't indicate what my ancestry is. Doesn't. Not even close. Okay. Yes, white passing can be a problematic phrase. And so instead of white passing, I would prefer white assumed myself or white presenting myself or light. I'm just light because I did not grow up in a white culture. I did not grow up in a white community. I've never had anything to do with that thought process and that culture. So when we are looking at decolonization, it is important to recognize that if you are of only European ancestry, then this is public, isn't it? If you are of only European ancestry, then you can decolonize yourself and you can decolonize your mind. But to actively be decolonizing, you need to go into a community that is currently working on throwing out their colonizers and help them. I just stated who I am. I'm very proud of who I am. Are you not proud of who you are? I'm not proud of my color, which is a phenotype, which has very little to do with me. I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of my culture. I'm proud of the things that I do. I'm proud of my very active, vocal need to go out and make sure that people are healing and people are actually healthy. I'm proud of me and my accomplishments and who I am. I'm not proud of a color that's arbitrary that is just named by somebody else, something, right? I have privilege and I obviously have this armor that gives me the ability to move in a lot of spaces and do a lot of things that unfortunately many of my siblings don't have. So I utilize that and I'm proud of that, right? So, how do we decolonize our brain, right? Albert Einstein wasn't technically white, he was Judaic, and most Judaic people aren't white, but just saying, right? Um, so how do we decolonize our brain? How do we decolonize ourselves? The first thing to do is to look at the indoctrination within you. Look at the indoctrination. That's exactly what I said. Look at the indoctrination that is going on around you. What is the indoctrination that you are dealing with today that you can change within yourself, right? Another way to decolonize is to take a look at your ancestry, your epigenetics, the things that are happening throughout the history of your family line, and to try and pick up some of those life ways again, right? So if you are working on, if you are working on, sorry, um, it's not my education system. I agree 100% that it's bought and paid. I made that statement at the beginning of the whole live. Um, so if you're working on decolonization and say you happen to be somebody in the United States who is of Irish descent, so you might go to the ancient Celts or to the ancient Irish and look at what their lifeways and their practices were before they were colonized, because the Irish and the Celts were all colonized by the Romans, right? And then by the Anglo-Saxons for the Celts within the island of Britain. So you can look at the lifeways that they're dealing with prior to colonization. And in those lifeways that they're dealing with prior to colonization, you can start utilizing them in your day-to-day life. And this will give you the ability to decolonize your mindset, decolonize the indoctrination that you're dealing with, right? Now, as was brought up, epigenetics has a lot to do with this. Epigenetics has a huge role to play in decolonization and in indoctrination. Okay, we are currently understanding that what happens to our grandmothers is imprinted in our bones. Okay, what happens to our grandfathers is imprinted in our bones. It's imprinted in our epigenetics. It's imprinted in our DNA. We can see the trauma response in our DNA several generations down already. This is something that science has proven. The whole term epigenetics is about the fact that what has happened to your ancestors is imprinted in your body, right? So if we are looking at what has happened to our ancestors being imprinted in our body, and we are looking at the idea of decolonization and removing indoctrination, and we, again, using the Celtic thought process, take our Irish ancestors, our Celtic ancestors, and decide that we are going to, excuse me, heal the epigenetics that we are dealing with and heal the indoctrination that we are dealing with, then what we do is we look at certain things that the Irish might have done that maybe connected them. So the Irish were an animistic group, just like the vast majority of the globe before different places are colonized by Western thought, which is removal of animistic thought process in many cases. So the Irish being an epigenetic group, so the epigenetic not the epigenetic, the epigenetic imprintation on you if you're Irish. Many people come over here in the potato famine, as was just mentioned. And so the epigenetic imprint of the potato famine on your bones might be maybe potatoes are something that are hard for you to eat. Okay. And maybe maybe you don't like farming, right? Maybe digging your fingers in the soils just feels useless to you, right? And maybe moving into a new space is scary for you. Okay. Right. So when we are looking at your epigenetics, these are things that are results most likely at this point from the potato famine, from having this famine, which was very much induced on the Irish by the English because of the fact that there were other foods being grown in that country that the English just pulled out and removed and would not let them eat, right? So you're dealing with a food that's been introduced in your country because potatoes are not from Ireland. Potatoes are from Turtle Island and Abiyala. So you have this food product that you've only had a couple of generations and now it's dying. And so now you're feeling the starvation effect of that. And the starvation effect of that a lot of times will lead people to hoard food. During the 1920s, the Great Depression, many people who lived through that as children actually hoarded food forever after, right? I remember growing up, women who had 5 or 6 chest freezers full of food that they never ate. They were hoarding because of the fact that they had dealt with famine. So maybe you hoard food through your epigenetics. Maybe you have to have lots of food. Maybe you overeat because of your epigenetics having to do with the Irish potato famine and coming over here, or your ancestors coming over here during the potato famine. So, how do you heal that epigenetic thought process? So, the first thing that you might do is research foods that are indigenous to Ireland and start finding those foods and eating those foods so that you're removing the thought process that this in your brain and in your epigenetics that this outside food has failed you, right? The other thing that you might do to heal that is remind yourself this is enough. This is enough. I've eaten enough. I feel full. I've eaten enough, right? So that reminder of yourself that I've eaten enough, I'm okay, right? Another thing that you might do is set a timer for everything in your freezer, and anything that's in your freezer that's been there longer than a month, you throw that out. You don't want to hoard that food, right? Or you give it to others. You shouldn't throw it out at that point, right? Because it's still good. So when you do those things, these things help reset the epigenetic thought process that is connected to the potato famine. Now, you can also take those things and take them a step further back. So, one of those things about eating indigenous foods and reintroducing your body to indigenous foods from Ireland and trying to overcome the epigenetics of the potato famine is that healing that comes from indigenous foods. When we're eating foods that are indigenous to who our ancestors are, a lot of times those things will actually provide a lot of healing. Just like we adapt into an area and into a biome, the foods adapt into a biome. We all have a place within that biome, right? And so our body adapts to those specific foods within that biome as we adapt to that biome. So, having been in Ireland for about 8,000 years, those who are Celtic from Ireland, their bodies have adapted, right? So, when you're reintroducing your body to those foods from Ireland that are indigenous to Ireland, you, why are you so mad you rich? You got it all. Why you got to be mad? I always get amused by people who are winning and they're pissed at everybody else because they're winning, or they're rich and they're pissed at everybody else because everybody else is broke, right? Like, why you gotta be mad that you're on top? Anyways, so you introducing those indigenous foods back to your body helps repair the damage within your body, right? Helps repair what is going on within your body that has caused those problems, right? Maybe one of those foods is butter that has been cured in bogs, right? And there is stuff within the bogs that actually, in the peat moss, that actually like seeps into the butter as it's being cured within there. And so the chemicals within that, or the nutrients within that, actually, when they come into your body, they find the cells within your body and they start healing. Now, of course, I know butter cures in bogs, but I don't know what actually that does for butter. So, I couldn't really say for sure. I'm just kind of using a hypothetical in this situation. So maybe when you're introducing that into your body starts to calm its need for extra because it's being satisfied with what it's been satisfied with. Maybe epigenetics that feel disconnected from the piece of land that you grew up in, or the indigenous land that you come from, the indigenous biome that you come from. Maybe a part of healing that disconnect is to get soil from that land, or to visit that land, or to incorporate specific things from that heritage within your home. um, it is a global thing to smoke cleanse. It is something that every indigenous culture has done, that every animistic culture has done, to my knowledge so far, and everything that I've studied and seen. There might be some out there that don't, but I haven't found them yet. So, smoke cleansing is something that is pretty global. Smoke cleansing with white sage, which is a California, Western Coast indigenous thing, is not. But smoke cleansing itself is global. So maybe you use rose and you use lavender to smoke cleanse, both of these things being things that are indigenous in Ireland. And so as you're smoke cleansing with that rose and that lavender, your bones, your ancestors, who you are, you're breathing this in and it heals you, right? Maybe you visit Ireland, find where your relatives were, right? These are all ways to connect to the ancestral needs that you have that help you to decolonize. And they're all ways to heal the epigenetic trauma that your ancestors went through from the potato famine, right? Now, of course, every other, everybody's going to have a different space, a different reaction. Not everybody who came from Ireland came during the potato famine. Some people came over way earlier. Some people came over rich, right? So maybe this isn't your specific ancestral heritage and what you need to do to both decolonize, remove the indoctrination, and heal the epigenetics, right? That might not be your specific, yet you can take what I've said and parse out, because you've got a brain, what it is that you need for your specific ancestry, right? What it is for your specific epigenetic trauma that you need to help your body heal from the indoctrination, the epigenetic trauma, and to decolonize, right? These are absolutely going to look, have a good one, Duncan. Absolutely going to look different for everybody. Myself, I don't teach anybody animistic thought process, and I don't teach anybody indigenous heritage thought process, because I am so mixed. Like, there's not a place that I don't come from. There's not a culture that I don't have ancestry in. So when I am practicing my faith and practicing my healing and practicing who I am, it takes from this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and it all mixes in together. And so I cannot tell you how to do it for you, because I can't distinguish which one's from which ancestry by this point. So I can't tell you that this comes from this ancestry or this comes from that ancestry. So you share this ancestry with me, so you should use it, right? When you are mixed, it is going to be like that. You are going to find that there are different things that you need to heal in your epigenetics, different things that you need to overcome within your epigenetics, and that each of those things are going to have different techniques, different things that you have to do, right? Different things that you have to embody within you or to heal from. Maybe you have to visit every single country that your ancestry comes from, right? Maybe you have to learn about different cultures. Maybe you have to wear the clothing of different cultures, right? So when we're doing that, what we have to do is individualize it. We cannot do any of this stuff based on my thought process, based on the way I'm doing it. You have to do it on your own, right? You have to do with what you're coming from. Um, so decolonization, so I'm going to go with Black in America, which is a different thing from African American, because African American many times are people who have come from Africa after the slave trade happened. Whereas Black in America is a completely different experience, and the epigenetic trauma of Black in America is a different experience from African American, right? African American, like I said, many times will come in after the slave trade, and so they don't have the epigenetic trauma of being enslaved. Whereas people who come in prior to the end of the slave trade have the epigenetic trauma of being enslaved, right? So if you are, another thing with that is somebody who is African American who has come in after the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade most likely knows who their ancestry is and where they come from. Whereas somebody who comes in through the slave trade, very often ancestry is stolen. Knowledge of where you're from is stolen, right? Either it's stolen initially or it's stolen from the next generations as children are sold off as infants and things like that, right? So I didn't say anything different than that, Cannon. That's pretty much what I said, right? And if you're in Africa, you would know that many people in Africa will tell you that that statement is not true. Though, well, there are many histories that are destroyed, that the resilience of Africans means that there is a lot of things that aren't destroyed, right? That there's a lot of history that isn't destroyed. Okay, your thought process on it, that's fine. So, um, being a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade here within the United States is going to be a lot of extra steps within healing, right? First of all, when you're looking at the epigenetic trauma, you have to find. So, say that your people are from a space that doesn't use yams, or doesn't use rice, right? So trying to heal through the usage of yams or healing through the usage of rice isn't going to give you that healing as much, because of the fact that it is not from a space that you're from. There are a few things that we can do for those of us who do have ancestors from the slave trade. I myself have ancestors from the slave trade. For those of us who do have ancestors from the slave trade, you can you can find things on the Dawes rolls. You can find things on different manifests that can give information of where you've come from, where your family lines have actually come from within Africa, sometimes, but not always. You can get a DNA test from one of the cheap DNA places and then upload that DNA test to other places to find more information. GG match, your true ancestry, things like that will give you a deeper understanding of what nations within Africa that you belong to prior to colonialism. Those are a couple of different ways. One costs money, right? Which not most of us don't have, right? So, and I recommend things like Ancestry and 23andMe in that case, because of the fact that those are like $50 compared to $300, right? So it's a really cheap way to do it, and you'll get some information, though not all information, because they don't test all of your DNA. The other thing that I have seen a lot of people do, and that people have helped me with, is there are certain knowledges of animistic thought process that you get within different groups within Africa that are a little bit cross-cultural. Nothing is nothing is monolithic, right? And I don't want anybody to think that there's any pan-Africanism or monolithic African in thought, right? You can go to, Oshun is a goddess that I was very much encouraged by many of my family members to follow, because Oshun is a goddess who kind of speaks to my nature, right? So maybe Spider is a god, Anansi is a god that kind of speaks to your nature. So you can look to what speaks to you and what sings to you sometimes too, right? So if you can't get the money to do the unfortunate job that many people who are the descendant of the transatlantic slave trades here within the United States and Canada and Mexico, if you can't do the monetary stuff, another thing that you can do is research and then what sings to you, right? It is through DNA stated that the Quay people are the original population of everybody on the planet, right? So all of us seem to have descended from the Quay population. And the way that we understand that is because the Quay population have all the genetics of Homo sapien. Any Homo sapien genetic that's out there is within the Quay population, or the San population in South Africa. And so if you come from the transatlantic slave trade and that epigenetics here within the United States, you can go to some of those thought processes as well, because you go far enough back, your ancestors there, right? Big to me, though, is what sings. If you are reading about something and in your heart you go, oh, that sounds right. Oh, that sounds like me, right? Oh, that sounds comfortable. Oh, that sings to my heart. Then that is something you should enact, right? If you are eating rice and you're like, this doesn't sing to me worth a crock of shit, and yet you eat yams, and you're like, oh, this tastes right. This tastes like home. This fulfills me in a way that the rice didn't fulfill me. Then it is likely that your ancestors ate yams. If you are looking at different cultures and you say you're, I don't remember, and I believe it's the Bantu, but I'm not sure. There is a nation within Africa where they do the red clay within their hair, right? And it might not be the Bantu, it might be another nation, but there's a nation that does this red clay within their hair. And they have different ornamentation. Maybe you're looking at that and your heart goes, holy shit, that feels like my grandmother did that. That sings to me. So then you adapt things from that nation because that's the nation that sings to your heart. So it does become a lot harder when we're dealing with people who are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade here within the United States. To decolonize your mind, you can still do these things. And you can still do these things without spending money. It just is going to be a little bit harder. And you have to listen to your own heart and your intuition more. That's what it is you have to listen to your own heart and your own intuition more. Because when you listen to your heart and your intuition, your ancestors will sing to you, right? Oh no, I'm sorry, Chuck Dot. I'll be over, like, it's all being recorded on YouTube. So if you miss it, you can find it there. Like if something happens where your phone dies or anything like that, you can absolutely find it on YouTube to listen to later. And it will be on for a while longer. So it will still be there. I'm probably only going to do a couple hours, but we're only like 40 minutes in. So again, it is harder. It is something that for many of us is a lifelong quest, right? For many of us is something that has been a lifelong time of trying, right? Yet when we connect to our ancestors will sing to us. When we sit at night with our ancestors before we go to bed and open our mind, our ancestors will sing to us. If nothing else, if you want to take it to the scientific level, you see that they sing to your bones, right? They sing to the epigenetics within you, right? Not only do you get the trauma from the epigenetic trauma, you also get the healing from the epigenetics. You also get the connection from the epigenetics, and you also get the love from the epigenetics, right? So yes, well, somebody who has epigenetic trauma of residential schools here within the United States has the trauma, or in Canada, has the trauma in their epigenetics of the residential schools from grandmother. You're going to also see that from great grandmother, you have the healing of the love that was there before the residential schools. I'm kind of working on it. I've thought about writing a book about all of this stuff, and I'm kind of working on it. I'm just not sure where I'm at with it and how to do it because it wasn't my intention with the book. My intention with the book was something different. But I am working on it. So you are going to find that if you sit with yourself, if you sit with your ancestors, and specifically with your ancestors, right? Not just with yourself, but with your ancestors. You can sit in a room, maybe you know that your ancestors came from West Africa, right? And so maybe you don't know which part of West Africa, you don't know which nation from West Africa, but your ancestors came from West Africa. And then you look at what the different herbs are within the natural biome within West Africa. And sage is pretty global. I'm not sure if sage is in Africa. I haven't really looked. Yet you might find that there is sage that is indigenous to West Africa. And so in that sage, you can bring that sage in and you can burn that sage within your space as you're sitting with yourself, right? So maybe you're burning this sage that's indigenous to West Africa as you sit on the floor or in a chair or wherever you feel the most comfortable sitting, and you go into yourself and you start thinking of your ancestors. I know that my grandmother escaped and went to New York. Okay. And so I can sit with my grandmother and feel the thought process and the trauma of that escape, what she went through that escape, right? I know that her daughter passed, right? So I can feel the trauma that comes with passing because there is specific trauma that comes with passing, right? So I can feel the trauma that comes with passing and I can sit in that space. And through that, I can start to push my understanding of my grandmother's back, right? And through that understanding of my grandmothers, as I'm pushing it back, I can start to, you kind of envision them around you. A lot of times, though, I'm visual, you might not be. It might be energy for you, it might be scent for you, it might be a feeling for you, it can be many different things. And so, as you're sitting there with that, you will find that whatever it is that you're feeling with me, it would be visual. I might picture my grandmother Emily, and then I might picture her mother, okay, and then Felindra, and then I might picture Felinda's mother, even though I don't even have a name for her mother, right? So I know that Flinder was mulatto, right? So I might picture her darker mother and her whiter father, right? And pull out the image of her darker mother within my brain and bring that to me, right? And then I might picture that grandmother and bring that her mother and then bring that to me, right? And as I'm sitting there and feeling them and picturing them, I go back further and further and further within that. And again, if you don't have the DNA, the roles, whatever it is that you need to actually like have actual facts. Like, I mean, I know for me that my grandmothers were Sudanese, right? I know that from DNA because I was able to do that. If you don't have that, because many of us don't. I didn't until 2 years ago, and I did it to find my biological father only, really. I've used it and I love having that access, but the main thing was finding my biological father, right? So if you don't have access to that, there are other ways to find that connection, right? Um, I would absolutely start with, when you're researching history of the transatlantic slave trade, there are specific spaces in Africa that most people were taken from. So you can look to those specific spaces first and find things that are indigenous within that space, smoke cleansing that's indigenous within that space, and things like that, and then bring that in, right? Um, Maybe look within that space and see what the styles are within that space, what the people look like within that space, because there are some spaces where people have slightly different overall features than other spaces. North Africa has a lot of people who are very light of skin. North Africa was classified as Caucasian when racial classifications came out, right? So maybe if you're from Northwest Africa or Northeast Africa, you might envision somebody who is lighter than most people would think of, right? So as you're envisioning those things, and as you're feeling those things and pulling them forward, sinking into it and going with what sings to you is the best way that I can describe it for you, right? So when we're looking at that, um, decolonization from somebody who is not in an area that is their ancestral area that is currently under colonization. So, if you are a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade here within the United States, decolonization might look like decolonizing your mind, getting rid of the indoctrination, right? And then going to the local community and saying, hey, I go to the local Cherokee nation and say, hey, I need to help. These are my skill sets. What can I do for helping you? What can I do to ensure that decolonization happens, that your land is returned to you, that your autonomy is returned to you, right? So again, when we are looking at decolonization, we can decolonize our mind, we can decolonize ourselves until we are helping whatever community that we are near or live in actually overthrow the colonialism and the oppression within their community, and actually remove the colonizers from their land. We are not fully decolonizing. We are decolonizing ourselves. Yet to decolonize, we must remove the colonizers from the area. And this is something that was brought up in the live the other day that I want to double down on because it wasn't quite understood in the live. And so it's important to understand. Even if we throw out all of the colonizers here in the United States, here, rainforest, are you indigenous to the United States or Canada? Because if you're not, then you don't have a say. You're a colonizer. Okay. And if you're indigenous to this area, you're saying that you have a problem with people helping you overthrow the colonization in this area, especially people who were harmed by the colonizers as well? I was able to find my father's family when I did the DNA tests. There are non-toxic gender roles, not roles. There are non-toxic genders. So gender as a role, the idea that men hunt, women gather, the idea that women nurture and men don't, those things are very toxic. There aren't really roles within gender. Gender doesn't necessarily provide a role as in what you're supposed to be doing, right? Haplogroups for indigenous people of Turtle Island and Abiyala include C1, X1, not 2. X2 is in Siberia, which is a daughter descendant DNA of X1. And Q is, wait a minute, I don't know. Q might be Australian and I'm getting it wrong. There's a list and I can't remember all of them on the list. But I know that X1 and C1 are two from that are indigenous to Turtle Island and Abiyala that are not found elsewhere, right? So are there toxic gender roles or are there non-toxic gender roles? I would state no. I would state that you can gender in a non-toxic way, yet you cannot gender roles for gender are very much toxic. Roles that state that because you are a specific gender, you're supposed to do specific things is not okay, right? It's not something that is healthy for people. And that really goes into that decolonization and that de-indoctrination, right? Joe, I don't know of anybody who is working for land back that thinks that everybody has to leave. Don't know anybody. Returning the tending and governance of the land to indigenous people across the globe does not mean that anybody has to leave that space unless they want to. It just means that the governance and the tending of the land returns to the indigenous people. Right? It doesn't mean you have to get the fuck out. It doesn't mean anybody has to get the fuck out. It means that now you're governed by somebody who gives a flying fuck about your health, right? Now you're governed by somebody who's not trying to exploit you. Now you're governed by somebody who's not trying to exploit the earth. Now you're governed in a healthy way. That's what that means. It does not mean get the fuck out. It means returning tendance and governing to the indigenous people of a space whose space it is and who have the right to that space, right? Who belong to that space. That is the difference between European thought or Western thought and indigenous thought across the globe. So some people believe they belong to a space, that space claims them. And some people believe that they own a space and that they claim that space. Okay? Indigenous people belong to a space. That space nurtures them. That space cares for them. That space provides for them. Western thought says, I own it and I can destroy it if I want to because I do what I want, right? So when we're talking land back, nobody that I know of, no matter what community, because I have talked to global communities, right? No matter what community that I know of that is talking about land back, not a single community that I personally currently know of, not a single member of any community that I personally have talked to here in the United States, Canada, Mexico, here in Turtle Island, in Abiyala, not a single person is like, get the fuck out. Every single person is like, we just want to belong to our space again and to be able to nurture our space again because you're destroying our space. If somebody comes into your home and they're destroying your home, you might not kick them out of your home because they need a place to stay. You might, though, state, hey, this is my home and you have to stop destroying it. And so you're going to allow me to create the own rules for my home so that you stop destroying it, right? So when we're looking at that, nobody is talking about kicking you the fuck out, I swear. Nobody. It's talking about returning tending and governance. We are currently living in this space where we're indoctrinated into certain ideas. And this indoctrination teaches us things that are false about ourselves. One of these things that we're indoctrinated into is the idea that we're all evil innately and that we're all violent innately. The rise of violence happens 10,000 years ago. We are 300,000 years on this planet as a species. There was no violence really before 10,000 years ago. There is nothing in the archaeological record that can be attributed not indefinitely, that can only be attributed to a violent thought process. There are skulls that are caved in, but does that mean that somebody hit the skull, or does that mean a rock fell from a cave wall, right? So when we are looking at these things, I don't know, tease. When we are looking at these things, we see that the rise of violence within humanity is only 10,000 years old, and it goes along with that ownership of land and that ownership of others, right? Stepping above the biome, deciding that you're perfect and you're something else, right? And so we are indoctrinated into this idea and this belief that we're all born evil and we must be cleansed of our sins to be okay, and that we are all violent, that we're all possessive, that we're all jealous, that we all are hoarders, right? That we all exploit. All of these things are things that you're taught that you have to do. And all of these things are results of trauma. Hoarding is a result of trauma. People who hoard because of trauma. Okay. Now, not everybody. We all know those people who have had millions of dollars from the moment they were born and they're still hoarding. That's hoarding as a result of indoctrinated thought process. That's hoarding because they were taught that. And in many cases, they belong to family lines that have narcissism or the dark triad within them. And so the idea of compassion and nurturing is not born within them, right? And in many cases, they have narcissistic parents. And so they've dealt with abuse their entire life, right? Hoarding is a result of trauma. The belief that you should not be nurturing and communal and taking care of each other is a result of trauma, right? And so all of this indoctrinated thought process is a result of prior traumas, right? When we were talking about, yes, when we were talking about the Great Depression, and we were talking about the Irish potato famine earlier, and the way that that can play out in your epigenetics is hoarding, right? Because I grew up, and Tease is talking here, Tisali is talking here about having a grandmother who hoarded because her parents lived through the Great Depression. I knew people who lived through the Great Depression as children, and so they hoarded, right? Hoarded everything, right? You'll see people, I don't clean. Fuck that. I'm not cleaning a goddamn thing. Not my job. I'll clean up after myself, but I ain't doing anything else because I was traumatized with cleaning. It was my own job. It was my only job. It was what I was supposed to do for everybody around me, and nobody else ever fucking helped me. And then I got screamed and yelled at and beat over it. So I don't like to clean. It's a trauma response. Can't clean, right? People can call me lazy. People can call me filthy. I'm never filthy. Still, I have a trauma response that every time I clean, I go like this and it feels icky to me, right? Trauma response creates these things within us. So hoarding is a trauma response. Not being compassionate and not being empathetic is a trauma response, because even if you have narcissistic personality disorder as a genetic trait within you, because it can be a genetic trait, you still have to have the trauma to change it from just a trait to bloom the trait, to trigger the trait, right? So people who are doing these things are doing these things as a result of trauma or epigenetic trauma, right? So innately, humans, like every other species on the planet, does not develop traits or is not created as a species with traits that are toxic to its species continuation. We are created as a species with traits that will continue our species. Biologically, we are nurturing, and biologically, we are communal. We must have community and we must have nurture to not only give birth to our children, but to raise our children. But through 25 years from neonate to fully formed adult brain closure, we're the longest ones from neonate to adult. We have the most life stages, right? So we are innately communal and innately nurturing. We must nurture our children from neonate to adult or they don't survive. So for species survival, for species continuation, you can't pump, dump, and walk away. You have to nurture that child to adulthood, right? And so we are innately nurturing and we are innately communal, because even today, it takes several different people for even a single parent to raise their child from neonate to adult. You got to have somebody babysit. You got to have the boss that provides you the job. You got to have the farmer that provides the food. You got to have the truck driver to take it to the grocery store so that you can go to the grocery store so that you can buy it and cook it, right? So you have to have all of these different people even today to create community to raise a child from neonate to adult. We are nurturing and we are communal innately. We're also innately curious. This is why we're the only ones who actually adapt our adaptations. There are other species in this planet that actually create tools that actually adapt their surroundings, right? We adapt our adaptations. This is something very unique to the human species out there, Homo species out there, because Homo means human, it is our genus. So we are indoctrinated into this thought process that instead of being innately nurturing and innately communal, that we are instead innately violent and innately evil and lacking compassion, that we innately are about self-serving. So we're indoctrinated into this thought process that we are all innately self-serving, and yet that is not anything that works positively for species continuation. And if something, studies done by archaeologists and anthropologists. My website that has my bibliographies on it is widdaord.com. And it is that specific information should be, let me go and see. I believe it is under early Homo sapiens on that website. There's a couple of different links for, it's just me compiling bibliographies. It is definitely my private website and is only there for bibliographies. It should be Homo sapien. Maybe not. Maybe it's not underneath Homo sapien. Human origins. It's in one of the bibliographies. You'll have to look through it probably a little bit to see what it is, where it is underneath those. I have a lot of different bibliographies on here, unfortunately. But what it was is there is a study that's been done by archaeologists and anthropologists that shows that we have roughly 2,000 individuals that we have prior to 10,000 years ago that we have found within the archaeological record. And of those 2,000 individuals, roughly 2% of them have things that can possibly be attributed to violence, but nothing is definitive violence. Things that could possibly be attributed to violence are if you have a skull that has like a hole in it from a rock caving it in, it doesn't mean that somebody welded that rock and caved their skull in. It could be because a cave collapsed on them, or it could be because there was a landslide, or it could be because they fell and hit their head on a rock. We do have it 30,000 years ago. I know of a spear point embedded in somebody's thigh. The spear point embedded in somebody's thigh could mean that somebody stabbed that person intentionally, or it could mean, no, it doesn't. I'm telling you the information done by studies. I'm giving you names or data. I'm like giving you numbers, right? So prior to 10,000 years ago, like this spear point could be embedded in somebody's thigh because somebody hit them with a spear, or it could be embedded in somebody's thigh because there was a hunting accident and they got hit instead of the mammoth, or it could be embedded in their thigh because they were flint knapping and it slipped. There are different ways that you can look at these things, whether or not they're actual violence, are there actually accidents or things that have happened naturally, right? So because there's nothing that is definitive violence prior to 10,000 years ago, and the 2,000 individuals that we have, and everything that could possibly be attributed to violence could also possibly be attributed to something else. And all of that is only 2% out of 2,000 skeletons. Then at 10,000 years ago, we start to see definitive violence. And we start to see a rise in it. We start to see the evidence of things that could be attributed to violence rise from 2% to 18 to 20%. And we start to see this violence become definitive. We see in Kenya at 10,000 years ago, a massacre of 8 people. There's a pregnant woman whose hands were tied into her lap as she's sitting crisscross on the ground, and she's killed from behind. Definitive violence. I'm not. And you obviously have no education in this subject. So you can either listen to those who have the education in the subject, or you can scroll on. I've given you the evidence. I've given you the sources. I've given you all of it. And whether or not you choose to take it, that's on you. But we're not going to continue the conversation of whether you think you're right or I am. You don't have the education. Obviously, you're not bringing in any education. You're not bringing in any sources. And I've pointed you to the sources, right? So no, I'm not. So when we look at whether or not we as a species are violent, we do not see that we as a species are violent prior to 10,000 years ago. At 10,000 years ago, we see this rise of violence in the archaeological record, and we see this rise of violence in the written record as we start to see written records. And what we see is that these things correlate with stratified societies and ownership of land. And we start to see the use of othering to maintain these stratified societies, right? So now 10,000 years later, you're indoctrinated into the belief that you're naturally violent and you're naturally evil and you're naturally going to exploit other people. And therefore, you need a government to maintain control over you because you're incapable of controlling yourself. Because you don't have a brain, because you don't have enough humanity to control yourself, because you need somebody else to tell you what's right or wrong for you to be able to distinguish what's right or wrong. Because you're just an evil, violent being that was put here for no other reason than God decided to, right? So many of the things that we have, their indoctrinated thought, right, are the idea that women are weaker than men. We teach our children, don't hit girls because girls are weaker, right? Well, factually, girls are not. Females, biological females, are not weaker than biological males. Biologically, males have stronger muscular attachments in the upper body, and females have stronger muscular attachments in the lower body. And females are able to withstand pain much more than males are. They're also more endurant than males are. So, which one is stronger? Yet we indoctrinate our children into this idea that females are weak and males are strong when we tell our children not to hit girls, right? So when we're looking at that, this is one of those things that we're indoctrinated into that really comes across all of society and does a lot of damage. Most people don't understand that this damages men as much as it damages women. If men are taught that they can't hit girls because girls are weaker, and girls come up and beat the holy living shit out of them, and let's be real, I don't know if you've met them, but I've known plenty of girls that can pack a strong fucking punch and KO you in a heartbeat, right? So then this girl comes up and they start beating the shit out of some guy, but the guy is taught not to hit girls, so he doesn't stand up for and defend himself. This is why domestic violence against men happens at a high rate, but we don't hear about it, right? Because men are taught women are weaker. So if you allow her to be violent to you, you allowed her, right? Instead of understanding that men and women are equal, that the physical strength differences aren't that different, right? And also average. When we talk about things, we talk on average. Average doesn't necessarily mean there's anybody that's actually that. So when you're looking at averages and the law of average, you take 100 numbers and you add them all together, and then you divide all those numbers by 100 and you get the remaining number. And that number is your average. That number could not be one of the numbers that you added together, and it is still your average. So if on average men are taller than women, that doesn't mean that most men are taller than women. It doesn't mean that more men are taller than women are taller than men. It just means that on average, right? People have to understand that average does not mean most. Average does not mean even a significant portion of the population. It's not even 50% of the population. Okay. So if on average men have stronger muscular attachments to the upper body, and on average women have stronger muscular attachments to the lower body, and on average women have more endurance than men, on average women are in fact stronger than men, and yet none of those averages mean that we're talking about over 50% of the population. And they are saying that we were wrong about hunter-gatherer gender roles. Gender roles don't exist prior to about 100, 150 years ago. And gender roles still don't exist in most of society. The binary idea of gender is very new. And the idea that the binary idea of how, like being straight, must be straight, is very new as well. All of those things are very new to our species, and they weren't seen in other prior species of human. So when we look at what this indoctrinated thought process is that we're all dealing with, right? Things like don't hit girls because girls are weaker when girls are not weaker. Things like you're evil because we're all born innately evil. Things like sex is a sin and you shouldn't have sex, especially if you're female. Things like virginity exists when virginity doesn't exist and the hymen is not what you think it is. All of these things that we're indoctrinated into, that we believe because we've been taught to believe them from infancy, because our parents taught us to believe them, because our parents were taught to believe them. All of these things are indoctrinated thought, right? So epigenetics really plays a part in that indoctrinated thought. No, the hymen doesn't exist the way we think the hymen exists. The hymen is kind of a donut. It's not like a membrane that goes across the whole thing. It's kind of like a donut membrane around it, and it can actually regrow. And it's not like you can puncture it. The hymen doesn't exist the way we think the hymen exists. And that's why virginity, as we think of virginity, does not exist. You can absolutely have never had sex with somebody, um, yet that doesn't mean that you're male or female. It just means that you've never had sex with somebody. That doesn't mean that your hymen is intact, because your hymen was never intact to start with, right? Those are all, again, indoctrinated thought that somebody gave you that's not true. And there's plenty of information to the contrary out there. There's lots of TED Talks out there on the fact that the hymen doesn't actually exist, right? So, I do think it comes from religion, and stratification. Because I went out and got this information for myself and studied many different cultures and many different peoples, and that's how I know I'm not the one indoctrinated. I didn't get this information from a teacher. I didn't get this information from a school. I didn't get this information from a religion. I actually didn't really go to a Western school for the most part. I actually went to an Islamic school for a year and a half as a child, and I would go to regular school like 3 months out of the year for a while. And it wasn't until I was in my teens that I actually started going to school on a regular basis. And then I was out of school by about 14, 15, because I was on my own by about 14, 15. So all of my information comes from having read archaeology text and historical text from like the time of five. That's actually how I learned how to read. And so I also didn't grow up in a mainstream society. I spent my first 5 years in an indigenous community, and then I lived in the middle of the woods for 5, 6 years, and then we were kind of on the outskirts of society for a little bit, and then we went back to an indigenous society, and then went further on. So my information doesn't come from mainstream anything. I don't watch the news. It's not something that I would buy into. I do have degrees, and yet I was always the person in class questioning things. I had professors who were like, "You need to come back and teach these people about how to decolonize. Like, you need to come back and teach people how to colonize, or how colonization worked." Right. So, I mean, I even in school, I was never somebody who bought in. I had to go into a little bit further. So that's how I know that I'm not indoctrinated, because the indoctrinated thought processes, I never had a chance to be indoctrinated into them. And because none of my thought processes come from a single source. My thought processes come from multiple different sources from different spaces across the globe. So none of them are coming from the same source. Also, like anything that has to do with Western thought, well, I've read most of it. I don't buy most of it. Right. So that's why I would not actually be the one worried about being indoctrinated here, right? I would ask you what part of what I'm having to say seems indoctrinated to you, right? I've given sources. I have told you why. So, what part about that seems like it's indoctrination to you, right? It goes against everything that you know and everything that the public has taught you. So, why would you think of it as being indoctrinated? And who do you think indoctrinated me into it? Right? Right? I do. Um, Only because of the fact that I've talked to a lot of people and I've witnessed a lot of things, right? So, when we're looking at those different theories of thoughts that are being indoctrinated into us, things like sex is evil and it's a sin, we see that those different thought process of indoctrination that we're indoctrinated into actually create toxicity within our environment. So when we are taught things like sex is a sin and to be sexual is a sin, or to be sexual is wrong, or to be sexual is to somehow lessen yourself into somebody's eyes, or we're taught that when somebody else is sexual, they lessen themselves in our eyes, we start to see sex as taboo. And when we start to see sex as taboo, we start to see perversion and toxicity enter into sexuality. So when we have children who are punished for sexual thoughts as children, then we see sexuality coming in as a toxic thought process. This is wrong. And so we start to see the wrong things cause sexual desires, right? So this is where we start to see people who SA. This is where we start to see people who are attracted to younger people. This is where we start to see these problematic issues within sexuality because of the fact that we have taught that sexuality is evil and wrong and it's a sin. And so instead of teaching healthy sexuality, we have indoctrinated ourselves into a toxic sexuality, right? I would say that children are over violenced with the media. Grand rising, lovely one. And this is why we have no problem with our children seeing violence all the fucking time. There's violence in their cartoons. There's violence in everything they do. Yet we scream if they kiss somebody. We scream if we see two people kissing in something that a child watches. It's okay for our children to witness brutal violence. Yet it is not okay for our children to witness love. We have outlawed witnessing love and affection, while we have rose and deified violence, right? It's okay for you to watch a cartoon where somebody gets their head cut off and blood is spurting out. It's okay for your 3-year-old to watch that. It's not okay for your 3-year-old to watch a cat and a mouse kiss in a cartoon because we think they're both boys, right? So I don't think that our children are over sexualized in the media. I think that our children are taught that sex is taboo, but they're taught violence is okay, which also leads to violent sex and violent sexual acts because violence is okay, but sex is taboo, right? These are all forms of indoctrination. We are taught that the parenting strategies from the Bible are good parenting strategies. And yet God is a narcissist and he parents as a narcissist. And because God parents as a narcissist and we're taught to parent the way that God parents, we parent as narcissists most of the time, right? We're taught that children have urges toxic to humanity, yet most people don't have urges toxic to humanity. Things that are toxic to humanity, those things come about through trauma. Those things come about through traumatic indoctrination of thought process, right? So when we are looking at the indoctrination and we see this happens through epigenetics and we see that this happens through, we call it things like breaking the cycle, right? We call it things like family history, right? And yet when we're doing these things, what we're doing is we're continuing a cycle of indoctrination, continuing a cycle of trauma, continuing an epigenetic trauma cycle, right? Well, I didn't say the media sexualizes children. Somebody else said the media sexualizes children. I'm not sure I agree that the media sexualizes children. I think that I personally believe that the media and cartoons and everything you see actually deifies violence, actually makes violence okay. Well, it says that sexuality is not okay. So it tells us that it's okay to harm others, but it tells us it's not, well, it's telling us it's not okay to love others, right? That to me is very much an indoctrinated thought process. It is the idea that it is more natural for you to be violent than it is for you to be loving, which is completely false. Biologically, we are not violent as a species. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal as a species. And therefore, it is more innate and natural for you to be a loving individual to somebody else than it is for you to be a violent individual to somebody else, right? Jean Bonnet, yes. And yes, I would agree that we do see sexualization of children. I just don't know if it's so much across the media as much as it is things like that, like beauty queen pageants, which we should not be doing at all for anybody, no matter what your age. And things like, okay, so we talk a lot about you shouldn't let a child wear adult clothing, right? Yet we don't talk about the fact that it's not the problem isn't the child wearing clothing that we perceive as adults. It's having an entire group of people for whom sexuality was traumatic and toxic and taught as a toxic who are now attracted to children because of the toxic upbringing and sexuality that they had, right? And so We talk about how children are sexualized, yet we don't talk about the fact that the only reason anybody wants to have sex with children or cares whether or not they look like sexual objects is because we have an entire group of people who have been taught through trauma that children are sexualized objects, right? So, yeah, but we've been dressing children as adults our entire time. Through the 1500s, children wore the exact same clothes as adults. Up until like the 1800s, when they started putting the boys in short pants and girls in short dresses, right? Which exposes more of them to be viewed. Up until that point, we actually didn't dress children differently than we dressed adults. When we're looking at children in many indigenous spaces, they don't wear clothes. You're going to outgrow it so fucking fast and it's going to get dirty, so run around naked. That doesn't make them look more sexual. That's not sexualizing them, right? It's not a sexualization of them. It is having a group of people who were sexualized toxic, right? So if you have, and we actually, if you read from people who were child molesters and who were caught, or people who are serial killers who are caught, and things like that, if you read books on the things that they have said about what they went through and why they're doing these things, almost every single time you're looking at somebody who was traumatized. If you're looking at pedophilia or you're looking at sexual assault, like people who are perpetual sexual assaulters, when you're looking at those two things, what you're looking at is somebody who explains having severe traumatization around sexuality as a child. I've read books of people who their mother, every time they touched themselves, would bathe them in bleach. Children naturally touch themselves. If you've ever raised a little boy, that's his first toy. Oh, I've got a toy attached. It feels good, right? And so when somebody takes that and instead of play with your private stuff in your private room, that's your private area, take it to your private area, right? Instead of allowing it and turning it into something icky, they turn it into a taboo. And so this sexualizes taboo within the brain of the child, right? Pageants are problematic. I'm not going to say pageants aren't. They are very problematic, right? And there is a whole subculture of sadists. Sadism is, again, something that comes from trauma. This is a trauma response. And it's an indoctrinated trauma response because somebody is taught something is wrong and somebody is taught something is taboo, or because the only attention you ever get is violent attention. So you become sadistic because in your mind, that is what relates to love, right? There are a lot of different things that come across it. Some sadists do have a normal upbringing to some sense, but I would not say that any upbringing that we have currently in most of our societies is a normal upbringing that doesn't encourage that kind of thought process, right? Just because somebody is a normal upbringing doesn't mean that it's not a traumatic upbringing. And most normal upbringings in the United States and Canada, most normal upbringings in the United States are actually very traumatic upbringings, right? So, right. What is normal, right? So, and I do think that you're right on pageants. Pageants are disgusting. I don't care what age you are. Pageants aren't something we should be doing. These are all examples, though, of indoctrinated thought process, right? All examples of indoctrinated thought process that A, come from trauma, B, come from the society around us, and C, come from epigenetics. So all of these indoctrinated thought processes and ideas, and I'm not going to be able to explain all of them to you. I don't know all of them, right? And I mean, I know that I have things that I've had to work through and change, right? And change somebody else's thought process from my brain, right? We all have those works that we have to do, right? When you're looking at hi Freddie, when you're looking at the indoctrination, it's not so much as looking at the different ways that we are indoctrinated. It is looking at how to step out of those different ways of indoctrination that we need to look at. Right? You need to understand that there is the indoctrination there, right? Yet understanding that the indoctrination there is there, just like understanding the colonization is there, is just the start. Everything else that we have to do comes after that fact. You have to have the understanding first. You have to see it before you can do jack shit about it. But once you see it, you have to start moving forward. You have to start removing it. I wouldn't say that most of those are greatest empires. We like to call them the greatest empires, but they weren't civilized. They were anti-civilization, right? Yes, us joining the armed services could be considered a little machistic. There are so many people in the United States, though, that join the armed services because it's their only way out of poverty. I joined the armed services because it was the only way I could think of to actually provide a house for my child. I had no other way to give her food or to provide a house unless I went back on state, and I was trying to avoid going back on state, right? So I joined the armed forces so that I could provide a home for her and monetary, and for many people who are living in poverty, the armed forces is a way out. And so I'm not sure if that's necessarily machistic or just the only way fucking else out, right? Yeah. And so I don't think that that's necessarily being machistic as it is taking the choices that you have, right? Taking the choices that you have. Well, I know a lot of people who join because they have children, because it's the only way to get their children out of the abject poverty that their children are living in, right? Um, in fact, most of the people that I was in the military with joined to get their children out of abject poverty, especially, and there were very many people who were of European descent who joined to get them out of abject poverty. But I know half of the people that I was in my that were in my basic training unit were indigenous, and the indigenous people within my basic training unit literally joined because it was the only way that they could get their children out of poverty and further on, right? Um, and that in of itself is absolutely it is but it is a choice sometimes where you don't feel like you have a lot of choices, right? I didn't know how to provide for my child, right? For myself personally, I didn't have family because my family stopped being family when I was 15. Um, their father was not participating in any of the raising, and was not participating in any of the financial care. Um, Childcare was a grand a month, and I couldn't make a grand a month at work, right? There wasn't a job that was going to pay me a grand a month, but I had to pay a grand a month, and rent was, half of that, at that point of time. We're talking 20 years ago. So there was no other answer in my mind at the time that I joined, right? So many people do join because there is no other answer. And there are people who join because they're sadists. There are people who join because they're machistic. I was essayed by a child, by a man when I was 15. I was essayed. I was on the streets and I was essayed, and that man essayed me and then went and joined the military. And when he joined the military, he literally told me he was joining the military so he could kill people legally. There are a lot of people out there who do for those reasons, right? There's a lot of people out there who they're very horrible human beings. There's a lot of people out there because they're given a choice between going to jail and joining the military. There's a lot of reasons, but most of the people that I knew that joined with children joined because of the fact that they were doing their best to escape poverty for their children. Um, I today do not think that it was the best choice I could have made. It was the best choice I felt that I could make at the time, but the damage that happened to my daughter was not okay, right? The damage that happened from me having to leave, the damage that happened from me going to Iraq, and the damage that happened with the person that was a military person that I ended up marrying. All of that damage was not okay, right? And I, looking back, wish that I had found another way, right? Yet it was on the list of the options that I had at the time, the only thing that I had that would work to pull her out of poverty, to feed her, literally to feed my child. I was not able to provide a home and food for my child without help from the state, which I was, of course, raised into this idea that being helped by the state was not okay, right? Um, and I knew a lot of women who joined specifically because of that. I knew one woman who joined who had 5 children, and her youngest was 6 months old when she joined. And she broke her leg, and so they ended up keeping her for 2 years. So by the time I met her in AIT, she had been in for about I think she was like 20 months in, and 20 months since she had seen her 6-month-old infant or any of her other children. And then they gave her a duty station that was a hardship duty station. So she couldn't take her children with her to that duty station. So she was given 2 years in North Korea. And at the time, that was a hardship station. So she did not see her daughter again until her daughter was 4.5 because of the military, right? There's so many problems within it, right? And yet I do know a lot of women who joined specifically because it was the only way they could get out of trauma for their family, right? So, yes, and that's true. Well, and I have severe trauma within the military. I have military sexual trauma. I was imprisoned in a tent in Iraq for 6 weeks by my platoon sergeant and assaulted. Like, I have severe trauma from the military, and that severe trauma from the military affected my choices and affected the life of my children after the military, because that severe trauma caused a lot of head change within me and a lot of trauma that it took me a decade, 2 decades, fuck off. It's been 2 decades. But it took me 2 decades to even seek help for some of that trauma, because I was taught that it wasn't right. Right. So these are all that part of that indoctrinated thought process, right? These are all that part of that belief that we're supposed to be exploitable. The belief that taking government handouts is taking government handouts, and how dare you, right? And have a great one, love. And instead of understanding that I pay into that as a taxpayer, I pay in to Social Security, and I pay into food stamps, and I pay into, the different things that we utilize for what we call welfare, right? I pay into all of those things, and all of those things are supposed to be utilized by us when we are having a hard time. So part of that thought process, which is part of my indoctrination growing up, was the idea that we shouldn't take handouts, right? That pride, right? And the idea that if you took handouts, there was something wrong with you, right? That's definitely an indoctrinated thought process that we need to overcome, right? The idea that communism is a bad thing, right? First of all, we've never seen actual communism enacted since, since 1492. We haven't seen actual communism enacted, right? We've seen communism based on capitalism enacted in a few places. And because it is, of course, an exploitative nature, because it is based on capitalism, that communism has caused problems, because it wasn't true communism. True communism, communal spirit, is acts of reciprocity, is making sure that everybody in your community has enough, is taking care of each other, right? Well, and I did afterwards, after I learned better. Yet, so we've been indoctrinated into this thought process that things like communism, things like communal care are not okay. We're taught that feeding the homeless is wrong. We have entire cities who are doing like fucking spikes so people can't sleep, right? We're taught that the homeless or the houseless, there's something wrong with them, right? And yet there's not. They're just no longer exploitable by society, right? They're no longer able to be exploited by the government. And because they're no longer able to be exploited by the government, we see that the government has taught us that there's something wrong with them. This goes into that othering thought process that we've talked about before, but we haven't touched on in here today. So let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit. So when we're looking at colonization and when we're looking at indoctrination, absolutely fizzle. I demand respect. I just remove it if it's not anymore. Took me decades to get there, but you either respect me or you go. When we're looking at that rise of violence that we were talking about, we see that rise of violence comes to stratified society and ownership of land. And we see that comes from this idea that typically in the beginning, it's narcissistic god kings, right? People who believe that they are the child of a god who was abandoned by the god, and you can see all levels of narcissism if you read these early stories of like Sargon and stuff like that, right? So we have these narcissistic god kings that decide that they are going to own land and therefore they're going to be able to own people. So in order to maintain this rulership over the people around them, they need to create a fear in the people around them so that the people don't see what they're doing. So if I am going to if I want you to give me all of your grain because you're a farmer and I don't want to do jack shit except sit up here, I'm going to tell you that you have to give me your grain so that I can feed the army that I'm accumulating, and I'm going to tell you that you need to feed the army that I'm accumulating to protect you from the barbarians in the hills. Now, once we get to where there's no longer barbarians in the hills, we start to see, I need you to give me your grain so that I can feed my army, so that I can make sure that my army can protect you from the other nation state that wants to steal your grain. And it's not me who wants to steal your grain, even though it is me who's stealing your grain. So I am going to do everything I can to make you hate your next door neighbor, or make you hate that other nation, or make you hate something else and think that they're the problem, so that you don't see that I'm stealing from you, right? And we see this from the very start of stratified societies. And in stratified societies, what we see is that need to maintain their power comes with this othering, right? And so we see that othering translates from the barbarians in the hills to nations when everybody else is in cities now, to gender comes next, where we see that the ancient Greeks start deciding that males are better than females. And so males are the rulers of society, and we other males versus females, right? After gender, we see religion come into it. When we see religion come into it, we see the idea monotheism comes around. And when monotheism comes around, we see this idea that if you don't follow my God, you're a sinner, and therefore there's something wrong with you, and you're trying to attack me, and therefore my army needs to be maintained. So I've got to pay my king. After that, we see that this translates into othering based on the concept of race that comes about in the 1400s, is based on the Bible, until we get the idea of evolution within the mid 1800s, where the theory of race is conceptualized and evolves into the theory of race as we understand it today, based on pseudoscience. And so othering becomes a racial othering, which is used to justify the atrocities that Europeans have been committing. And then after we see racial othering, we see othering come as immigration. Currently, we have this huge thing in the United States, especially, where we've decided that people who have been here for 10,000 years or 20,000 years or 50,000 years are immigrants. They're non-immigrants. It's been their land for generation upon generation. And if they want to cross an arbitrary border, they can cross an arbitrary border. It wasn't their border, right? Or the homeless. We get this idea that people who are homeless are somehow a threat to you, that poverty is somehow a threat to you, instead of understanding that it is not the poverty that is a threat to you. It is the rich. It's the narcissistic God kings. It's the government who bases itself these days on narcissism that is the harm for you, that is causing the problems, right? So when we learn that all of this othering, all of this thought process that you should be against anybody that is on the same level as you are, is something that is being used to maintain power, right? So when we're looking at othering as a means to maintain power, we see that indoctrination goes along with that. If I can indoctrinate you into the idea that race exists, when race is a colonial construct, not a biological fact. So if I can indoctrinate you into the idea that race exists, if I can indoctrinate you into the idea that there are gender roles, or that biological sex actually means something, if I can indoctrinate you into the idea that immigrants are here to harm you, if I can indoctrinate you into the idea that it is your next door neighbor who wants to kill you, then you ignore the fact that I'm creating law after law after law after law to steal from you, to take from you, to harm you. And so if you are listening to that indoctrination that's coming across from our government, if you're utilizing the othering that comes across with that indoctrination, you're buying in. You're supporting white supremacists. You're supporting a system that is not there to help you, right? You're supporting a system that is there instead to exploit everything it can from you. And once it's exploited everything it can from you, it's going to kick you out on the streets, and you'll be the next houseless in poverty, because you have been exploited for all your worth of exploitation. And now you're just a husk. Used up. We don't care anymore, right? And this is where we get into the fact that all of these things really tie in together. Okay. When we are looking at decolonization, again, remember that unless you are a member of a group that is currently under colonized rule, you cannot fully decolonize. You can decolonize your brain and you can decolonize yourself. And you can do that through looking to your ancestry and trying to connect to your ancestry. Yet you cannot fully decolonize unless you go to communities who are living under colonization and help them to decolonize. Okay. Land back globally is what is going to stop the climate destruction that we are all dealing with, right? So when we are looking at land back, we're not looking at everybody get the fuck out. What we're looking at is the return of tending and governance to Indigenous people. It doesn't mean anybody is asking anybody to go anywhere. It means returning tenants and governing to Indigenous people, right? Actually, colonization is a word that is actually clearly defined as taking your government into another space, another community, and replacing their government with your government. That is colonization. So, when we are looking at decolonization, it should be understood that, again, land back doesn't mean everybody get the fuck out. It means returning of tending and governance to Indigenous people across the globe. When we look at indoctrination, we can look around us and see all the different things that are indoctrinated into us if we just take a hot second and kind of sit with it, right? And then we can go and we can take a look at the things that are true about us, like the idea that we are inherently evil. No species on this planet speciates with inherent traits that are toxic to its species continuation. I want you to sit with the logic of that for just a minute. No species on this planet speciates with traits that are toxic to the continuation of their species. You don't speciate without hair in an environment that is extremely cold, right? You don't speciate with cats don't speciate with eyes that are specified for the daylight when they hunt at night. Species speciates with traits that help the continuation of their species, that continue their species. No species speciates with things that are toxic to its continuation as a species. Now, things can mutate and happen. Absolutely. Narcissism is a mutation, right? But we do not speciate with traits that are toxic to our species continuation. That's a logical thought process if you just sit with it for a minute. And I literally have, like I said, there's sources on my website, right? Yet all you need is your own brain to think about that. No species speciates with traits that are toxic to the continuation of a species. And therefore, speciating as something that is toxic to our species continuation is not going to happen. Therefore, speciating violent or speciating evil is not something that happens. Now, we can create those things. We've obviously created those things, and yet they're not innate to our species. We are innately communal, and we are innately nurturing, and we are innately curious creators, right? So when we are looking at those things, it's important for us to understand that to find the difference between indoctrinated thought and reality, right? You have to start looking at the indoctrinated thought logically. You have to step out and look at what logic states. And then you have to start looking at, for me, it comes with studying ancestry and history, right? For you, it may be something different. Maybe you need to dig into science a little bit more. Or maybe you need to connect to somebody else's history because you don't know your own. So you're going to go and listen to what other people have to say. Now, that doesn't mean appropriate their culture. That doesn't mean take their culture and use their culture. What it means is that to get rid of that indoctrinated thought process, you allow other thought processes within your brain, because these other thought processes are going to take this thought process and open it up so you can understand. Okay. When we meet two brains together, we have an explosion of understanding almost every single time. When we lived with the Neanderthals for 100,000 years side by side in two caves in the Levant area that were a 5-minute walk, we had an explosion of understanding. This is at the time where we start to see cave art. This is the time where we start to see burial of our dead. This is the time where we start to see bodily identification with art. And this is the time where we start to see changes within stone tool usage for both groups. And this is because whenever two groups meet, whenever two brains, whenever two boxes, whenever two concepts meet, a whole new one develops, right? And so you might have to sit with people who aren't from your own ancestry so that you can evolve and you can understand and you can hear so that you can change this concept. You might just have to sit with this concept and see how faulty it is. On average, well, do you know what average means? We all went over averages in math in grade school, right? I mean, I only went 3 months out of a year and I still did averages in math in grade school. So then you understand that average doesn't even mean most. It doesn't even mean 50% of the population. So if on average men are stronger than women, that doesn't mean even 50% of men are stronger than 50% of women. It means that some men are stronger than some women. And if you sit with the logic of a statement, you sit with the science of something, right? And then you listen to other voices, whether it's indigenous voices, whether it's African voices, whether it's Asian voices, whether it's other European voices. You listen to other structures and concepts so that you can move through that indoctrination and figure out what part of it is indoctrinated and what part of it is real. Now, this is something that is going to be as individual as you. And we are all individuals. There's nothing wrong with being an individual. There is wrong for working for the individual instead of working for the community. Yet each individual brings an individual skill set to the community, right? So we should be working for the community while maintaining the beautiful individual thought processes and skill sets that we have, because it is bringing those beautiful individual thought processes and skill sets into the community that creates a better, greater community that uplifts the community, right? So we all are going to have to go through that decolonization and de-indoctrination journey on our own way. Again, as I was talking earlier, if I'm sitting with my ancestors, for me, it might be a visual thing. For you, it might be an energy thing. For you, it might be a scent thing. For you, it might be a taste thing. We have to understand that each and every one of us are going to do these things differently. Every one of us has a brain that was developed differently, even children in the same household, right? Even twins have individual ways that they do things, right? Even the mirror image identical twins, like, well, I think mirror image aren't quite identical, but the ones that are exactly like, everything about them is the exact same. Even those twins, as their brain develops, they develop different skill sets. They develop different things that they're passionate about. They develop different ways of understanding the world around them. One might develop a connection to the way things taste, whereas another one might develop the connection to texture. So if they're both eating cottage cheese, this one might like cottage cheese for the taste, and this one might like cottage cheese for the texture. So you have to figure out on your own. And this comes as easy as, wow, I know that scent works for me. So what I'm going to do is, I know that my people are from the Middle East, that my ancestors are from the Middle East. So I am going to get frankincense. Frankincense is from a tree that comes from the Middle East. I'm going to get frankincense and I'm going to burn frankincense so that the scent connects me to my ancestral heritage and starts bringing that understanding in my brain. I'm going to start, maybe my connection is taste, and maybe I've learned that my ancestors are Sami, right? And so to connect to my Sami ancestry, I might go and find an access to reindeer meat, and I might eat reindeer meat in the hopes that that's going to bring that connection out, that it's going to bring that connection with my ancestors. When I'm looking at on indoctrination versus de-indoctrination, I might understand that indoctrination being something that is completely about how we're taught, right? What we're raised in, what the society around us is raised in, right? So I might understand that the theory of thought that I'm taught is very Western, very based in Greek or Orthodox thought process 3,000 years ago, right? So instead, I might look to Asian thought process, look to ancient Chinese thought process, which is going to give me a new way of viewing thought process. Now, I might not change some of the thought processes because some of them might be cross-cultural, right? I might change some of the thought processes because they're not cross-cultural. I might look at cross-cultural thought process and go, God, that just doesn't work in either area. I don't like it. I'm going to find something else and go to a different area, right? But it is definitely about opening up your brain to new thoughts. It is about, so we currently live like philosophy. I was discussing philosophy with somebody who was over here the other night. Philosophy currently is so inbred that it's like, not white, but thank you. It's so inbred, it's like the Habsburg jaw. Philosophy is so inbred, it's like the Habsburg jaw. If you can't trace your philosophy back to an ancient Greek philosopher in an academic setting, they won't listen to you, right? So, yeah, that's really true. So, when you're looking at philosophy being as inbred as the Habsburg jaw, you might go, well, shit, all philosophy that traces itself back to Greece is so inbred. I don't want anything to deal with it, right? So instead, I might go and pick Indigenous Australian philosophy. Go look to Indigenous Australians and listen to the oral traditions of Indigenous Australians and see what the philosophy there is that translates best for my brain, right? So you have to start looking outside what you see every day. That's the first step to everything. When you're trying to decolonize, when you're trying to de-indoctrinate, the first step is this the normal blind that I'm being fed every day? Then it's probably wrong and I need to go somewhere else. I'm not a Democrat. The Democrats are right wing in this country. Our Democrats and our Republicans are the same fucking, they're the same. There's no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans within this country. I am a burn it to the ground, motherfucker. It's all fucked up. Burn it to the ground. Right? Yes. Yes. And so when we are looking at those things, the first thing to do is go, okay, so if this is something that is being taught every single day, it's probably wrong. So if gender is being taught to me as having two biological sexes every day, I might start going and looking at the science of sex to find out that there are three biological sexes, not two, right? If I'm indoctrinated into the thought, if I am an American, proud to be KKK, right? If I am that type of American, I might look to the fact that every day I'm being fed a rhetoric that immigrants are out to kill me. Now, if every day I'm being fed a rhetoric that immigrants are out to kill me, I might wonder why people are trying to force feed me that, right? And once I start wondering why people are trying to force feed me that, then I might start looking at, well, what is immigration, right? And then I might start looking at, well, okay, so if that's what immigration is, who is actually immigrating, right? So the first step is to really take a look at the thought processes that you have that it seems like somebody's kind of force fed to you. And any thought process that you've been told since you were a child is most likely something that was force fed to you and most likely an indoctrinated thought process. And if it is something that you see that is shared by vast numbers of people, it is also likely an indoctrinated thought process. Yeah, anything coming from the media, anything coming out of the news, anything coming out of movies, and unless, so we have currently an influx of Black and Indigenous creators in very many different things. We have an influx of Black and Indigenous people in science. We have an influx of Black and Indigenous people in media and in movies. We have an influx of Black and Indigenous people in the government, which is amazeballs, right? So we have these influxes of Black and Indigenous people in the United States that is kind of across many different fields, right? So like Res Dogs, great fucking movie, a great fucking series every day of the week, right? So this is something that is not teaching you indoctrination. It's teaching you something else, right? It's teaching you outside the mainstream indoctrination. So the biology, or not biology, the science of the science of ecology, right? If you're looking at the science of ecology, You should be looking to indigenous people for the science of ecology, right? Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for outstanding nature writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology. So if you're looking at environmental biology, you can't go better than listening to indigenous people, right? So when you're looking at how to de-indoctrinate or decolonize your thought process, your first step is to go, that's mainstream, so it's likely wrong. What else is there, right? So mainstream agriculture teaches us that monocrop agriculture is healthy. It's not. It's caused climate destruction from its very first. Yet here is an ecologist that can show you why indigenous ecology is actually better for the planet, right? So that's your first step with it, is to look at what is everybody telling me? What's the other side of that story? If everybody tells me this is it, who are the people that are saying it's not, right? If it's something that somebody is going to beat into my head every day of the week, Dems versus Republicans. Every day of the week, we have somebody telling us that the right is trying to kill us and the left is trying to save us, or the left is trying to kill us and the right is trying to save us. Every day of the week, somebody tells you that. Every day of the week. Doesn't matter if you're on the right or you're on the left. Every day of the week, somebody is telling you the other side is trying to kill you. And yet when you stop and you go, okay, so every day of the week, somebody is telling me Republicans are trying to kill me. Yet if you look, they hate the government just as much as I do. Maybe it's the government that's trying to kill me. Every day of the week, somebody's trying to tell me that the Democrats are trying to kill me by allowing transgender people into bathrooms. But can a transgender person really harm me in the bathroom? Probably not. So what's the other side to that, right? So when we are looking at whether or not we're indoctrinated into something, the first thing that we should look at is it something that we're hearing everywhere? If it's something that we've heard everywhere from our childhood, if it's something that's really, you hear it in all the homes, you hear it in all the medias, you hear it in all the TV shows, then it's probably an indoctrinated thought process, right? And if you're never hearing the other side of the story, right? If you're never hearing the argument, then it's probably an indoctrinated thought process, right? So when you're every day, baby girl, every day. So when you're looking at that, the decolonization, the de-indoctrination, right? The removal of toxic gender, right? Which is any gender role is toxic gender roles. Gender doesn't have roles. Gender is a construct within our brain. Biological sex doesn't have roles, right? Biological sex is never shown to have roles other than which one inserts seed and which one carries the baby to fruition, right? Those are the only rules that we even see in biological sex, right? We even see that, well, we like to think that males aren't nurturing, that males are in fact an extremely nurturing biological sex, and that we need the nurture of males, right? For our children to be healthy, right? So anything that is a gender role is a toxic gender role. Gender doesn't have roles. Gender is about feeling. Gender is about sense of self. It's not about what role you take, right? So when we're looking at these three things, it is the combating of these three things that leads us to the last, right? So, I mean, personally, myself, I don't want to taste human. I just don't, right? I also believe that anytime you eat something, you imbue its spirit into you, and I really don't want to imbue those spirits in me. So, personally, I'm not going to participate in the feast, right? Yet I will absolutely participate in the overthrow, right? I will absolutely participate in the getting rid of high legal. And that is what the phrase eat the rich means. That is what, and that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that want to actually physically knife and fork it, right? There are absolutely people out there. When we're talking about things like that, when we're talking about eat the rich, when we're talking about burn it to the ground, when we're talking about overthrowing the government, what we are talking about is getting rid of a toxic governmental structure, right? What we're talking about is the fact that we currently have people who will hoard and hoard and hoard while other people are starving, right? We have people in this country who have more money than they will ever be able to spend in their lifetime, in their children's lifetime, in their grandchildren's lifetime. And we have people in this country who don't eat, who won't eat tonight, right? There are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who will not eat tonight. And there are about 10 people in this country that have enough money that they'll never, ever, their children, their grandchildren will never and ever be able to spend it. And they could end poverty if they wanted to, right? Yet they are hoarding it. They're hoarding it because they are taught that that's what they're supposed to do. They're indoctrinated into that. They're hoarding that because they have almost always, there is this lack of compassion and empathy within them, right? This lack of compassion and empathies that is within them comes from this indoctrination, and sometimes it comes from having mental deficiencies, having one of the dark triad issues within them or things like that, right? So when we are looking at this, what we are looking at is humans that are no longer human. You dehumanize yourself when you no longer subscribe to the idea that humanity takes care of each other. When you are no longer communal and nurturing, when you no longer care whether or not other people are in pain, as long as you have way more than you will ever need, you could not care less if somebody is starving in the street, you have dehumanized yourself. I can't say it any plainer than that. When you stop acting with humanity, when you stop acting with humanity, you are no longer human. You have dehumanized yourself, right? And when we have an entire governmental structure that dates back 10,000 years working on that, right? And that dehumanization, again, first of land and then of animals and then of other human beings, right? That lack of compassion, that lack of empathy for the world around it. When we have something that has been indoctrinated into people for that far back, unless they have a willingness to change, there's not a change that's going to happen. And most of them don't have a willingness to change. Now, again, I personally am not participating in any feast because I believe anytime I eat something, I imbue its spirit in me. And the last thing I want to do is imbue the spirit of a toxic fucking group of people. Yet I absolutely believe that the overthrowing, the burning to the ground, the removal of the governmental structure that is based on stratification and hierarchy within our system will absolutely reset things into a healthier way. Now, again, burn it to the ground doesn't necessarily mean we burn everything to the ground, right? Eat the rich doesn't necessarily mean we eat the rich. Those things are concepts to show that this doesn't work anymore. It's done. Get rid of it, right? And because most of us who are looking at these concepts and going, we need to make change, are doing it because we're doing it from a space of empathy and compassion. Very many of us are doing it with a space of, I don't want to cause bloodshed. I don't want to cause trauma. I don't want a war-torn country. None of us really want that, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I have a child who will tell you right now she's ready for bloodshed, right? She's ready to shoot people. Of course, she has not been to a war zone, so it's a little different, right? So for the most of us, we have that compassion. I know you are, love. I'm talking about you. We have that compassion and that empathy that states that, well, we want to see this end. We're done with this. We can see the trauma that it's causing, that stratification is causing, that hoarding is causing, that capitalism that's causing, that exploitation is causing. For the vast majority of us, we don't want it to be something that's going to harm other people to end. There are ways to end this. There are ways to end this without causing massive amounts of bloodshed. for me, I believe that those ways of ending are education. And I believe that those ways of, and I think I could take it over right now. If every single one of my 27,000 followers that I have currently followed me and we could take it over. Like, I know we could overthrow this shit, right? And I believe I have ways I could do it without bloodshed. And I know that there are many other people out there who have ways that they could do it without bloodshed, right? Because it is not about the bloodshed for most of us. For most of us, it is about ending the bloodshed, right? It's not about inflicting trauma. It is about ending the trauma that is being inflicted. Because for most of us, we are living under constant trauma. For most of us, we are living in constant, unending trauma. We have no safety. We have no security. We don't know where our next meal is coming from. We don't know if we're going to have a roof over our head next month. We don't know if we're going to have a running vehicle or a job next month, next week, tomorrow. For the vast majority of us, we are living in constant trauma, and we are not trying to traumatize the country. We're trying to get out from underneath that constant trauma. So again, when I say things like eat the rich, and when other people say things like eat the rich, some of them want to actually take a fork and knife. I'm not going to state that that's not real. Some of them want that fork and knife, and I can't say I blame them. Personally, I do not want that fork and knife because, again, I don't want to imbibe that spirit within me. And I hear that I'm not a fan of pork, and I hear that human tastes like long pork. So, like, I'm not a fan. So, there are other ways to do it. Yet the end concept is the same. The end concept is that the rich are out here trying to kill us every single day of the week. And they do it through the governmental structure. They partake in the governmental structure. Most of the time, they are the governmental structure. And it is only by removing their power that we are going to get to a space where we're safe. And I don't even think jailed. I think get them the fuck out of our country. I think land back globally, return tending and governance to indigenous people. I believe in reciprocity and barter. I do not believe in a monetary system. I don't believe that we need a monetary system. It's not something that we've needed before. It is something that we use specifically within stratified societies to maintain control, right? So I do not believe that we need the monetary system that we have, right? So when I look at it, my personal thought process is to end the economic system that we have and return that economic system to a reciprocity system where we are returning the structure of the government to indigenous governance and indigenous land tending ideas. And by returning the structure of the government to indigenous governance and returning the structure of land tending and land interaction to indigenous practices, then we can end. I had a professor tell me once that many people believe that civilization comes when you have enough food to feed your poor, when you have a stockpile of food, right? Many places that we call civilization haven't done that. Like our earliest civilizations weren't like that, right? Our earliest civilizations are actually not very civilized. They might have an abundance of food, but they feed their armies instead of their poor. When we look at indigenous groups here within Turtle Island specifically, and within Abiyala specifically, when they were documented by the indigenous or by the Europeans, when the Europeans arrived, they documented spaces where nobody was starving, where the elders had care and where orphans did not really exist. Like if somebody didn't have parents alive anymore, they were taken care of by the nation because children belong to the entire nation, right? And so when we look at returning tending and governance to indigenous societies, what we're looking at is a lack of that poverty scheme. We're looking at a lack of not having enough to eat, right? We're looking at care for community as a whole instead of care for individual above community. And so for me, I believe ending the stratification, returning it to indigenous tending and governance gives us the ability to end the current economy structure. Now, that doesn't mean that indigenous groups don't have economy. Many indigenous groups had economy. It was a different method of economy. Um, what it does mean is that when you are no longer when you're no longer able to hoard little pieces of paper, you're not rich, right? There are many cultures out there that have what we call big man. Many forms of leadership out there we call big man forms of leadership. Big man forms of leadership are where the person who leads a nation or leads a community gives away everything they have. And you are considered a great leader the more you give away, right? You might have the least house in the village, yet you are a great leader because every person in your village has a good house and every person in your village is eating tonight. You might eat the least of the food, yet you are a good, strong leader because every person in your village is eating of the best, right? So, for me, it is community. It is using that communal thought process that ensures that everybody is taken care of, right? And it is removing our current economy is completely arbitrary. Arbitrary meaning somebody makes it up. Your dollar bill isn't backed by Jack. If the government failed tomorrow, your dollar bill would mean nothing. We see this all over the world. When Iraq fell, I was in Iraq when Iraq fell. Their dollar bills meant nothing, nothing anymore. They would trade them for other dollar bills, right? They would trade their dollar bills for nothing. They would just give you dollar bills because it meant nothing anymore, right? When we're looking at this stuff, what we're seeing is that economy is arbitrary and made up. And we base our entire lives upon this economy. And our entire lives is based on an arbitrary, made up thing that only certain people have control over. So for me, I believe that part of that is not having anybody able to be rich. When there's no money, you can't be rich based on money, right? You might be able to collect a lot of cool things, and maybe you're rich because you have a lot of cool things, right? Yeah. I love The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's an amazing book. As it stands, we don't have a choice. As it stands, we live in an exploitative economy. And as it stands, we live in capitalism. As it stands, we live in sick, late staged capitalism, right? As it stands, most of us need to drive a car. As it stands, most of us are reliant on fossil fuels. As it stands, most of us are reliant on money to eat. As it stands, most of us are reliant on money for a house. As it stands. And so we also must give grace to ourselves and to others because we have to live within this. To dismantle it, we have to survive it. To survive it, we have to work within it. That doesn't mean that we have to work within it to dismantle it. It does mean that we have to survive it, right? And so until you can get out of the working within, you have to survive within, right? Some of us are able to get out in different ways, and that is amazeballs. Some of us aren't there yet, and that's okay too, because we are all doing our best to get there, right? When I went to Standing Rock, people were all shitty about people driving cars to Standing Rock. Why are you driving a car to fight the oil industry? Because that's the only method of transportation that I can to get there. So I'm going to take that method of transportation that I can to get there so that in the future there are other methods of transportation, right? I'm totally against capitalism, yet I'm going to buy food from a grocery store because I live in a city and that's the only thing I can do, right? There's also a lot of Sami in Standing Rock as well. Hi, Token. There is a lot of different nations in Standing Rock. The Maori made it. There were Brazilians who made it. We got to watch Brazilians do prayer dances. It was really amazing. There are a lot of different communities from across the globe. There were Buddhist monks who came to Standing Rock, right? And all of those people absolutely had to utilize, the fossil fuel industry to get there, right? Sometimes we have to utilize it so that we can get rid of it, right? So while I may have to participate in capitalism and drive my car to the grocery store so that I can eat, I can still participate in the dismantling of capitalism so that my daughter won't have to drive her car to the grocery store to eat. It is not an American-only issue, Mike. I am discussing it on an American-only standpoint at this point, though I have talked about it as a global standpoint quite a bit in here, only because of the fact that I am trying to attract people within my country, right? So that I can work within my lane and so that I can get people around me to understand a little bit better. Currently, that's why I've got the flag behind me. We often talk. I don't usually talk about current. I usually talk about 20,000 years ago. I don't usually talk about current, right? Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Today I did put the flag up in the background because I am talking. I'm talking from the space that I'm in, right? Instead of telling people in Africa how to decolonize or telling people in Asia how to decolonize, I'm talking from the space that I'm in because it's a space that I understand enough to have say, to have, a lane, to have an understanding, right? Um, and and there are different ways that what I have to say can benefit people in those other areas, right? Like we're talking about overthrowing colonization governments. The Welsh can absolutely utilize that. The Sami can absolutely utilize that, right? We're talking about if you're decolonizing, but you're not from the group that is actually colonized or the community that is actually colonized in your area, that you go to the community that is colonized in your area and you talk to them about, I bring these skills to the table. How can I help? What can I do? How can you use me to ensure the overthrow of this colonization system? That's something that the Sami can absolutely utilize. Or that Swedes or Norwegians or Finnish people can absolutely utilize when trying to decolonize their thought process by going to Sami people, or people in Britain can absolutely utilize that by going to the Cymru or going to the Kennewick, right? So we can absolutely see that those things can absolutely be utilized in other spaces. I am currently focusing on the space that I'm in just so that I stay in my space, in my lane. Yet we absolutely see that for us to be able to decolonize, to de-indoctrinate, to get rid of those toxic gender thought processes, to get rid of those toxic thought processes within us, that we absolutely have the need to get rid of the indoctrinating parties, right? So like if it is your government that is leading in this indoctrination thought process, you've got to kind of use getting rid of that government to get rid of that indoctrination thought process in the end. Of course, you've got to live within that structure until you can get there, right? I've been going for like 2.5 hours, and that's about my limit usually. So it depends on how you judge the communism, Mike. So there are levels. So like Marx is a brilliant man, yet Marx was still working from a capitalistic standpoint on too many levels, or the people who have utilized Marx at least have worked from a capitalistic standpoint on too many levels, right? So if you're working on communism, it's better to, so in New Zealand, maybe go to the indigenous groups that are still in New Zealand and talk to the indigenous groups in New Zealand about, how to animist, how to decolonize, right? How to return that to that prior colonized thought process, right? So, and again, nobody who's looking for land back is trying to kick people out. People who are looking for land back, absolutely, know that there are many people in the community who are still necessary, right? Well, I don't know who you are or where you're from. So, unless you are in, are you fighting for land back for your people? And if you're fighting for land back for your people and that's what you're looking for, you're probably the first person that I've seen that's looking for that. I can't remember a single other person who looks at land back as get everybody out of this country, right? So when you're trying to decolonize as a group that is colonized, returning to the pre-colonized thought process is really kind of the start with it, right? So, oh, well, then if you're looking for land back as a get the fuck out of the country, where are you going? Right? So, if you are African, then unless you are a member of the, you'd have to be in Africa to think of land back as, kicking people out. Okay, cool. So you're going to go to Ghana and you're going to start land reclamation in Ghana. Okay, that's cool, right? They kicked the French government out of Mali. They didn't kick all the French out. South Africa kicked the South African the government that was foreign out. And they kicked the rich white landowners out. Absolutely, took back their land. Right, that was their land. Yet they didn't kick everybody who was white or of white descent out. There's a difference, right? So there are absolutely ways to decolonize by looking at the thought processes that were there before. There are unfortunately areas where the indigenous thought processes are no longer accessible, right? Places that have been colonized. I saw a show about population settlement in Ireland. It said early settlers were brown and blue-eyed. I know it's rare now. Back then, was it that rare? So when Ireland was settled by Homo sapiens roughly 8,000 years ago, because that's when it comes out from underneath the ice. The first settlers in Ireland are absolutely very dark of skin and light of eyes, just like the first settlers of Britain. The first settlers of anywhere across the globe are dark of skin. Some spaces have that lighter eye coming in, some do not. But the first settlers of everywhere across the globe. We do see places like Scandinavia where there are two groups settling Scandinavia, one who is light of skin and dark of eyes coming over from the steppes in the east, and one of whom is dark of skin and light of eyes that is coming from the southern part of Eurasia, of Western Eurasia, like the Iberian Peninsula and France. But as people are moving across France and as people are moving across Eurasia and the first movements out, we're actually absolutely looking at darker skin and light of eyes. So when we're looking at that, we do see that dark skin is, all of us were darker skin globally first, right? We all start that way. Because we, as a species, all start in Africa. Now, of course, there are other species that start outside of Africa that we do incorporate into our genetics and into our DNA as we're moving across, or, as we're just getting outside of Africa. And so we do see some of that coming across. And yet, even when we're seeing some of that coming across, we're not seeing that means, or, that in mixing and stuff like that, we're not seeing evidence of any of us having lighter skin until later on, as Homo sapiens, at least. So when we are looking at all of this, I want to remind us again that we are all nurturing and we are all communal. That is our species innateness. That is innate to our species. Biologically, we know that we're all innately nurturing, we're all innately communal, because biologically we have mandatory midwife assisted childbirth. We must have somebody assist us in birthing our children. And because we must have somebody assist us in birthing our children, we know that we must have community to give birth. We also know that we must have nurture of that child from the time that they are born until the time they reach adulthood. We are the only species that has 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Those 5 life stages from neonate to adult end when our brain fully forms at 25. Currently, it's 25. I'm sure it was earlier on. That translates into the fact that we must have nurture from birth to adulthood, right? Every being on this planet has to be nurtured from birth to adulthood. And yet no other being on this planet has as many life stages or as long of a period of time from neonate to adult. The other closest or the other longest is elephants, and it's like 5 years, right? So we have 25 years from neonate to adult. And in that time period, we have a need for extensive nurturing that we do not see in any other species. No other species takes 2 years to learn to walk. Most other species are walking at birth, right? And so when we look at that, what we look at is the fact that we must have a nurturing community, a community ready to help nurture a child through all the stages of brain development and growth, right? It can't just be one or the other. It can't just be the mom. It can't just be the dad. It needs both. And it not only needs the mom and the dad, but it needs several members of a community. When we're looking at us as an early species, you need roughly 30 members of a community at least to maintain a community stasis, to maintain community safety. You need roughly 10 or more people out hunting to maintain safety. You need at least 5 people out to gather water, at least 5 people out to gather any other sustenance, like, or not sustenance, but any other need, like reeds for basketry, water, stone for flint knapping. You need several different people to do these things, because if you don't have several different people doing these things, predators will get you. Not only that, but having that community makes it go faster in a lot of ways. The other thing that we see is that within all of that, you need somebody to watch the child while you're doing that. You don't want a screaming, bawling child out there where you're trying to hunt. It's going to attract predators. You don't want a screaming, bawling child out there where you're gathering water from the river, because there comes the crocodile. So as we're looking at these things, we need somebody that stays at home. We need somebody to make sure that fire stays going or is capable of maintaining that fire. We need somebody who is working on maintaining food production, right? And we need people who are working on making tools and maintaining tools. So as a species, we need roughly at least 30 people to maintain community prior to now. Now we need about 5 people to maintain community to raise a child from neonate to adult, minimum. If we're going, 5 people at one time, right? Not like 5 people over the course. Like if you get a teacher that's different every year, you might need 100 people to raise you from neonate to adult, right? So in this, we see that we are nurturing and we are communal as a species. When you are nurturing and communal as a species, and you're living in a society and an environment that discourages nurture and discourages community, that in fact teaches you to harm others, and in fact teaches you not to be loving and communal to others, not to have compassion or empathy for others, the result is depression. The result is anxiety. The result is not feeling comfortable in your society. The result is the pain that most of us are going through. So if you're dealing with a lot of depression and you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, you are having a healthy reaction to a sick society. You are having a healthy reaction to a sick society. And in having that healthy reaction to a sick society, you are able to see what is going on in a way that many can't. Because those who do not have those feelings, those who are no longer able to have that compassion and empathy that creates the pain and the depression that many of us are going through, aren't able to see the problem. And if you can't see the problem, you can't fix it, right? So those of us who are having a healthy reaction to a sick society are those of us who are necessary to change the sick society. So if you are sitting here depressed and anxious, you are what is necessary for our future to change. You are what is necessary for us to heal from this sick society. So please do not let that depression get the better of you. You're not the problem, you're the solution. And I know for many of us, we think we're the problem. We're not the problem, we are the solution. Because it is only by seeing the illness, by feeling what is wrong and understanding that there is something wrong, that we can create the change to get rid of the wrong, right? We are all worthy and worth something just by being here. Just by sitting in your chair, driving in your car, playing your video games, you have worth to the continuation of our species, and you are necessary. Do not let those who are trying to steal from you or trying to hoard from you convince you that you're not worthy because you're not exploitable. Your worth does not come from your ability to be exploited. Your worth does not come from your ability to be exploited. Your worth comes from the fact that you're breathing. You continue our species just by being here, right? And those of us who are able to actually see the issues and the problem might in fact be more worthy than those of us who are still exploitable. That doesn't mean that you're not worthy if you're exploitable, because we are all, again, still trying to live in this hellhole and survive it, right? Whatever you need to do to survive it, as long as you're not harming other people, as long as you're not losing your own humanity and your own compassion and empathy, right? Whatever you got to do to get through the next fucking day most of the time, right? Because if you see it, we can fix it. If we see it, we can fix it. So if you see it, you're necessary. So whatever you have to do to survive, as long as you're not being shit to other human beings, right? Go ahead and continue because that's what we got to do, right? You are worthy just by being alive. You are needed just by being alive. And I need you to understand that this depression and this anxiety that you deal with is not because there's something wrong with you, but because there's something wrong with the world around you. And you are necessary. You are not the problem. You are the solution. We can de-indoctrinate. We can decolonize. We can remove these thought processes and we can remove the toxic environment that we are in. Okay. And so until next time, absolutely and always, until next time, I want to remind you that you are nurturing and you are communal and you are creative. We need whatever it is that sings to your soul to change the world that we're living in. And if you're dealing with depression and anxiety, it is because you are healthy and you are not the problem. You are the solution. So stick it out. You're necessary, you're loved, and you're needed. And we will get there because we're working really hard at it, right? And for those who always take it there, I don't give a shit if you follow me. I'm not here to be your creator or your messiah or your any fucking other thing. And I'm certainly not here so that you can follow me without fucking doing your own research and your own knowledge, right? I'm here to give you a little bit so you can dig a little bit deeper. I'm here so that you understand how beautiful that you are. But I am not a messiah, and I am not here so that I can indoctrinate you into some thought process. I'm certainly not trying to start a cult. So please don't follow me like that, right? If it speaks to you, hear it, but this isn't about that, right? I'm just a person trying to help make sure that people are educated so that we can love each other again. Mainly because I'm terrified to leave my house. I'd like to not be agoraphobic. So if I can get y'all to see that we're loving, beautiful human beings, maybe people will stop attacking other people and I can leave my house safety again. Take care, everybody. I'll be back in a couple of days, I'm sure. You can follow me on YouTube and it will alert you when I go live. I do try and make sure and share out and make sure that people see it when I go live. It doesn't always happen. And until then, take care of yourself. You are necessary, you are needed, and you are loved. Bye, everybody. And to my one person on YouTube, much love. See you later.